If there's any truth, it's that the entire multidimensional infinity of the universe is almost certainly being run by a bunch of maniacs. Douglas Adams, author. Experience 9, Interdimensional Space Station, February 1st, 2022, approximately 2:01 a.m. to 4:27 a.m. I've switched bedrooms since the last experience, as we prepared that room to be a nursery for our little one. I'm now settled in the guest room for the time being and have acclimated to sleeping in there. I had wondered if changing rooms would affect the experiences. I know that probably sounds silly, but from what I've read in books like Seth Speaks and the Law of One series, the connection to non-corporeal beings in other planes of reality is quite easily broken by changing the position or orientation of the sacred spot where one has historically had success in making contact. The position of the, quote, instrument, as Ra calls it, aka our bodies, is like the dial on a radio, isolating just the right frequency band to receive the exact wavelength they broadcast themselves on. So, on some level, I feared that changing rooms might put an end to it all. I'd had one visitation in Chicago, but that seemed to be a fluke. There was no guarantee that this wouldn't make me unreachable to them. But as you probably already guessed, despite what Ra and others have said, it didn't matter. Because whatever this is, it isn't channeling. Somehow, they know how to find me wherever I am. Last night I was feeling heavy and depressed, with a longing for connection to the ETs, feeling that perhaps the most recent experience had been the last, and yet on some subliminal level, I knew that another visit was imminent. I've always been hypervigilant by nature, but ever since these experiences began in 2021, I've paid meticulous attention to any minute feeling in my body or my environment that might indicate that they are nearby. Recently, I've had an extremely subtle feeling in the center of my brain, a kind of knowing, but also a physical sensation that occurs infrequently, hours or sometimes even days before an impending visit. I've learned to feel and pay attention to this sensation, however imperceptible. I went to my bed at a normal time, around 11 p.m., and put on a guided meditation video from one of my go-to Reiki YouTubers, in which she summoned or channeled Archangel Metatron. The music was strange and eerie, unlike her other videos, to the extent that it almost felt like maybe there were some production errors. But even though it gave me an unsettling feeling, I surrendered to it and kept listening. About halfway through the meditation, I fell asleep, as was the goal. And about 2 hours later, I awoke to the familiar feeling of a soft presence hovering somewhere above me, scanning my entire body, followed by a ringing mostly in my left ear, and some in my right. It was unlike the other ringing I've heard so far, in that it was not as concentrated of a tone, but sounded more diffused and less focused. The experience was as though someone far away, outer space I assumed, was pointing a device at me, scanning and trying to get a lock on me, almost like using a stud finder to search for the right place to drive a nail. The idea being that once they locked on, the device would cause my body to resonate at the correct frequency, which would enable them to grab me and pull my consciousness and astral body to their location. It was obvious to me that they were clumsily using their instruments to do this. As they locked on to me, it felt like my entire body was encapsulated by a blanket lighter than air. I felt myself being pulled upward through the subtle layers of space-time. As I've said before, it feels like rapidly flying upwards, passing through the floors of a skyscraper, seeing all the floors and everything on them as you ascend, all while being cradled in something that felt like an interdimensional rescue airlift. They made several unsuccessful attempts to bring me to their location. The first time, I was lying on my stomach with one of my arms under me. I can't remember which. And when I heard the ringing, I realized it was them, and so I tried to cooperate and move my arm to get more comfortable. Somewhere along the way, I got the idea that if I'm not lying perfectly still on my back, it'll somehow hinder the process. But I have to remind myself that when I look back on all the previous experiences, it doesn't really seem to matter what position I'm in. If they want to take me somewhere, they'll do it. The ringing occurred and I felt myself being pulled upward. But as I ascended, the strength of this tractor beam, if that's what it was, began to weaken and I felt myself completely back in bed. I turned over on my back for a little while, waiting for them to try again. I felt something scanning me. Perhaps they were trying to lock on again. I don't remember a ringing happening, but I remember thinking that they were not going to be successful, so I kind of gave up trying to be cooperative to the process. I looked at my phone to see what time it was, and it was 2:01 a.m. I thought, this is an odd time for these guys. Not their usual time frame, but what do I know? I was convinced nothing was going to happen at this point, so I just rolled over onto my stomach and decided I'd prefer to just get some sleep rather than waiting for them to keep trying. I fell asleep for a few minutes after that, and I awoke to a ringing in my ears. I can't remember which, but it was likely sloppy like the other times, and I felt myself rise up a few inches into the air, where I was left dangling. My body felt as though I was in some sort of claw machine. That game at the arcade where you use a joystick to try and catch a cheaply manufactured toy. In this case, I was the toy. I was eventually moved towards the wall at the head of my bed, and they slowly ran me into it head first, but it didn't hurt. I was out of body, so I passed through the wall, but not like a ghost. It felt more like the wall was made out of some sort of spongy material compared to its usual density. This attempt was unsuccessful too, and they put me back in my bed. Either they lowered me down, or perhaps my astral body naturally returned back to the physical once they disabled the tractor beam. At this point, I knew they were going to relentlessly keep trying, so I gave into the process and just patiently waited and tried to assist them by relaxing as much as possible. The next attempt was successful. I heard the ringing, again I can't remember which ear, and felt them pull me up towards the ceiling. This time, it was much more steady and certain. I moved quickly up through the layers of space-time, and the higher I went, the more I lost consciousness. This felt how I would imagine high-G training feels for astronauts, but why this would happen to someone in the astral state is a complete mystery to me. After completely losing consciousness throughout this ascension process, I awoke in a different place, as is common with these types of experiences I've come to find. It felt like I was being carried by a very large person, but I was lying on my stomach, so everything was from the perspective of looking down at the floor. As this person carried me, all I could see were legs and shoes. They wore gray, shaggy pants, almost like they were wearing a bear suit. Either that or this person was a giant Ewok. And they wore gray, glittery sneakers. The laces were also gray. I thought they looked like Chuck Taylors, but without the white tip over the toes and the white trim along the sides. They put me down on the floor, onto a pallet made of bedding. This pallet was a faded, rusty red color with a blanket and a pillow. As soon as I was put down and able to move autonomously, I sat up and looked around the room. It was a small bedroom, but not one I've ever seen before. There was a bed to my left, probably a queen size, a closet to my right, and a door leading outside the room to the left of the closet. On the other side of the bed there was some furniture that I sensed but didn't look directly at, and I think there was a window on the left wall to the left of the bed. I took all of this in over the course of a few seconds, with the most obvious thing in the room consuming most of my attention. A very pretty young East Asian girl looking at me. She looked to be about in her 20s, with long, straight black hair down past her shoulders. She sat in a chair directly across from me, in front of the pallet I was on. She was looking down at me, and at one point her face got really close to mine. I could see so much detail in her face and her makeup, which now escapes me. We spoke to each other, but I can't remember anything that was said. Some time passed, and I noticed that there were 2 people to my right and another person on the bed to my left. Where there was previously a closet, now there were 2 people sitting in chairs and using some sort of technology to either monitor me or perhaps do something else entirely. The strange thing was, after a few minutes, these people suddenly became very familiar to me, to the extent that I said something to them like, "Oh, hey, it's you guys." There were 2 young men on my right and a young woman on my left. They all appeared to be of Latino descent. The woman on my left had straight dark hair and was rather petite and skinny. I recognized her and one of the other young men to my right. I can't remember what they looked like as clearly, but they all appeared to be in their 20s. I got the feeling I was in some sort of college dormitory, and that these were the people who had brought me. I should mention that I do not actually recognize these people, or find them familiar now, but at the time, there was a recognition and a familiarity with them, that I had seen them before in other experiences like this. They were happy that I recognized them, but they seemed distant and preoccupied with something else. I tend to ask a lot of questions in these states, in an almost rude or unfiltered way, only to remember nothing when I come back. The only thing I remember is that they always politely answer my questions as best they can, like humoring an inquisitive child. They always use as few words as possible to answer. Everything is short and sweet with them. I say them, referring to the overarching qualities and cumulative experiences that I've had with all of the combined entities who have taken me out of bed at night. They are all somehow related, though until now I've never seen the same entity twice. I can't be sure whether they are shapeshifters or if I really am interacting with this many different beings. Just once, I'd like to see a familiar face, and not have it be an incepted familiarity, but someone I truly recognize. Once I had gotten acquainted with everyone and asked all my questions, I lost consciousness. After an unknown amount of time, I woke in a different bedroom. At first, I wasn't sure if I was back in my bed at home or not. Apparently, though, they had moved me somewhere else because I found myself lying on another pallet, very similar to the first one, or maybe the same one, but this time I was in a different room. It was very dark and wasn't arranged like a bedroom. There were other things in the room which indicated that they had made a sort of makeshift bedroom for me. I didn't get a good look at the things in the room, but I got the sense that it was a sort of utility closet. After a few moments of looking around, I went into the next room, which was illuminated and very active with people moving about, busy with various tasks. It was a very large sort of garage or hangar-like room with extremely high ceilings, which doubled as a communal living space, almost like the industrial loft apartments I lived in during my time in Brooklyn, but in outer space. And that said, I don't actually have any memory of leaving Earth and going to space. There was just a knowing that this structure was in space. And when these knowings occur, I often ask myself, how do I know? And the conclusion I've come to for now is that they have blocked or removed certain details that they don't want me to remember upon waking. But for whatever reason, they don't entirely erase the whole memory, and whatever is left floating around in my mind comes through as a broader understanding of something, just without the specificity that a memory would have. In this case, this resulted in the general feeling that I was in outer space, but with absolutely no idea where. This could have been just outside Earth's orbit or some other solar system, for all I know. There were all sorts of human-looking people there, except for two. I remember being in the center of this large room, talking to these two people who looked very similar to what we would call white humans. They had short, blonde, curly hair and were not wearing very much clothing. They wore what you might imagine a post-apocalyptic style or something akin to the attire for the Lost Boys from the movie Hook. These people's skin had an almost rainbow-like, iridescent color scattered all over their bodies where their veins and arteries would be. It was beautifully odd. The other difference I noticed was that their facial proportions and bone structure were somewhat Neanderthal-like, but they were not unevolved or unintelligent beings by any means. This was simply a physical trait. I remember the gums and the teeth of one of the males being very unusually proportioned. Very small teeth with a lot of gums showing. His eyes were also spaced very widely apart from one another. The whole vibe I got from everyone I saw there was as if they were some ragtag crew of space mechanics from some cheesy sci-fi from the early 2000s, like Firefly or maybe characters from The Fast and the Furious in space. It was bizarre, but very real, in that I completely believed that these young men and women lived like this. We spoke at great length about his relationship with his family. He told me some weirdly personal things that his father had previously said to him about reproduction. In the moment, he told me verbatim what his father said, and I kept repeating it to myself afterwards so as to remember upon returning home. But so much time has passed while I was away that I completely forgot everything. It was sort of funny and bizarre. Something about reproduction. He had a healthy sense of humor about it, and I felt comfortable around him. There was also a female with him of the same species, but I didn't really interact with her. It was unclear what their relationship was to each other. But when I look back on it, there's this intuitive feeling that she was maybe his sister. After our conversation, I remember there being another white, human-looking young man with a white t-shirt, brown pants, sort of a stout build, with blonde, shaggy hair and some stubble on his face. I was trying to exit the area, and he stood in my way. I thought he must have not been paying attention, so I apologized and politely tried to maneuver around him. But he kept trying to move exactly where I was headed, to the point that I realized he was being playful with me. He seemed almost perturbed by the fact that I apologized for almost bumping into him. But I explained, on Earth, people can be very combative and confrontational, so I've learned to just apologize and try to continue on in order to avoid a misunderstanding or confrontation. And he seemed puzzled and slightly annoyed by this. It was quite confusing, but eventually I was allowed to pass. It could be that he was sort of bullying me. Maybe he had a problem with my being there. This whole entire place was populated by college-age individuals, so I sort of chalked it up to aggressive adolescent behavior and tried not to read too much into it. Shortly after, it dawned on me that there had been a sort of liaison with me the entire time, watching my interaction with these beings from a distance, waiting for me to finish chatting so that he could continue showing me around. I think he wanted them all to interact with me as part of the experience, and the reason he was distant was perhaps to study the interactions. Strangely, I didn't remember him showing me around prior to this, but I got the impression that he had. Like most of these experiences, I felt slightly drugged or impaired in some way. It's as if the quality of these other dimensions causes some kind of constant disorientation as a result of some incompatibility with my innate resonant frequency and theirs. A slight disharmony, I suppose, but not enough for it to be unbearable for me to be there. In retrospect, I realized, upon waking, that this liaison was the only person I never got a good look at. He was like a 20-something-year-old white-looking human. He may even have been wearing a lab coat and carrying around some sort of digital tablet or clipboard with him. He was giving me the tour of his station, which had the vibe and decorum of a college dormitory mixed with the look of a very DIY space station. Scrap metal holding the place together, almost like the way the ships look in the Matrix movies. But they had a lot of room and a lot of equipment. The liaison showed me around the station over the span of what felt like hours, at intervals in between many other conversations with various individuals, none of whom I can remember. During my tour of the facility, something caught my eye and I couldn't stop myself from walking over to get a closer look. I remember peering over the edge of a short staircase, which led into what looked like the kind of docking station you might see from the old Star Wars movies. In this case, though, there were no ships or people in the room. It was a slate gray color all around, and on the right side wall, a garage door type airlock, which I could only assume led directly to outer space. This is all I can remember about the station, other than the rooms I've already mentioned. At some point, I lost consciousness again, but this time I didn't wake up in a bed, but rather, I found myself standing in a dark room, which was only illuminated by the light coming in from the doorway of another room. There was no door on this other room. It was just an opening that looked like a doorway. Once I entered the room, what I saw surprised me very much. This space looked almost identical to my late maternal grandparents' kitchen. My grandmother Rami was there with my late grandfather and a few other older-looking people who I didn't recognize. I looked to the left of the kitchen, towards where the living room and dining room would be, and it was exactly as I remember, with the exception that the room was filled with elderly people sitting on the couch, in the chairs, and filling up virtually every piece of furniture in the room. They were all eating something, and very preoccupied by it, as though they didn't even know they were being observed. My liaison was standing there in the kitchen, waiting for me and telling me about my grandparents, and what their current experience is like in this realm between the living and the dead. I asked him if his space station was located in another dimension or in the dimension where Earth resides, and he said that where we currently were was an in-between place, but that his space station was located in the same dimension and universe as Earth. I think he found my questions and ignorance of time and space funny and entertaining. He also mentioned something about being able to travel interdimensionally as a way of explaining how we found ourselves there and how I was brought there. But that much was obvious by that point. He and his crewmates essentially had the ability, or the technology, to walk back and forth seamlessly between our dimension and what we call the afterlife. But they didn't let me see that part. The transitory process was hidden from me, or perhaps removed from my memory. The next thing he told me was extremely bizarre, and absolutely ridiculous to the point where, even now as I'm writing this, I feel as though he had to have been testing my discernment, or even poking fun at me. He started telling me about how these people had been put into a group in which they must spend the equivalent of 524 Earth years in this in-between place, consuming bacon. Yes, bacon. While he was telling me this, we seamlessly entered a fully immersive virtual environment, which depicted everything as he continued to narrate. The liaison and I stood about 50 feet away from the scene, as we watched a small group of people in a forest-like area waiting for the bacon to drop from the sky so that they could be fed like caged animals. The bacon was the size of a car, and a very large amount of it dropped from the sky. I could see the texture of it glistening as it fell to the ground and shattered into pieces. Some younger people, again in their 20s or perhaps even younger, rushed over to grab and tear off the pieces they wanted. They began biting it like jerky, tearing off pieces with their teeth from whatever they were holding. They were clearly ravenous and had been reduced to some primitive state by some unseen orchestrator. They were dressed and groomed like modern-day humans. Their appearance was relatively clean, not like someone surviving in the forest, but their behavior was feral. I remember thinking that none of this added up, and that this whole thing was absolutely absurd. I doubted very seriously the validity of what I was being shown, and still do. It looked and felt very real, of course, but the sheer preposterousness of what I was seeing made me distrust my eyes, and I questioned internally why they would orchestrate such an elaborate lie. How stupid and gullible did they think I was? One thing in particular, which alerted me to the fact that this was a manufactured vision, was that the bacon looked like poorly rendered CGI, like Pixar bacon, which only stood out more clearly due to its juxtaposition to the people and the environment, which were indistinguishable from reality. This only served to further increase my suspicions that I was being shown a bizarre and ridiculous farce, except my liaison wasn't laughing. There was no gotcha moment where everyone broke character and began pointing at me and laughing hysterically. He was dead serious. At this point, any small level of trust that I had developed for him went completely out the proverbial airlock. But of course, I kept that to myself and just went along with the rest of the experience. Shortly thereafter, I lost consciousness and woke up in my bed. At first, I was very disoriented and wasn't sure if I was back in my room or some other strange place. But once I realized that it was all over, I looked at my phone to see what time it was, and it was something like 4:27 a.m. I laid in bed for about another 45 minutes, going over everything in my head, trying to make sense of it all, and making sure I could put together the sequence of events as accurately as possible. What the hell did I just experience, I thought. It was undoubtedly an adventure, and even a fun one. But who were these adolescent little tricksters who were toying with me? I knew, from experience, that whatever and whomever I had just interacted with, that they were most likely not who they presented themselves to be. This one was a doozy, and I knew I would need a lot of time to process it, or even speak about it to anyone. Afterthoughts. Out of all the experiences in this book, this is definitely one of the ones I've been most reluctant to share. I think enough time has passed, and I've integrated enough by this point that I'm much less worried about it than when it first happened, which was about 4 years ago. Suffice it to say, it's taken a lot to get to this point. Despite the high probability that I was likely the butt of an elaborate joke to these adolescent ETs, overall, I was still quite pleased that it happened. It is a feeling like nothing else, to travel to these extraordinary places and visit with extraordinary beings. To know for certain that you are in a very real relationship with non-human intelligence is a spiritual high incomparable to anything I can think of. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it's because it makes me feel closer to a truth about myself that is hidden from me. Maybe it makes me feel closer to what I perceive as an authority on the universe, whether or not that's actually true. They're not all kind or enlightened or benevolent, but the experiences are enriching for what they are, nonetheless. Sometimes I feel like a pioneer, exploring inner and outer space, the only difference being that I don't control when the exploration occurs, nor do I get to decide the destination. The more frequently this happens, the more I want it to continue. I know there are a great many things to be learned and understood from these unique experiences, and whatever ability I may possess that enables these contacts to take place. Maybe the mysterious experiences of my childhood was them gifting me the ability to connect with them in this way. As I look back on the clumsy way they went about bringing me to their space station, with the numerous failed attempts and the janky hold they had on me, it's exactly the kind of behavior that one would expect from beings who presented themselves as college-aged humans, if that's what they were. Maybe I was part of some alien hazing ritual. Abduct a human and make him think that when we die we become mindless animals, doomed to spend eternity consuming meat like pets for aliens. Or maybe my liaison was showing me that some of us do get adopted as pets for extra-dimensional beings upon dying. That's the kind of thing you wouldn't want to know about in order to have a happy life, right? Is the Earth just one big human breeding ground so that interdimensionals can have human souls for pets? Maybe the inhumane way that our civilization is structured is not a human failing, but a kind of grooming program so that we'll be well-trained, docile pets for them. That might be the most batshit thing I've ever thought. If I really go out on a limb, I can see a world where this group may have been trying to tell me something they weren't supposed to about our place in the universe. Maybe they were trying to help in some completely bizarre way. Why the hell would a dead person need to eat? I have a million questions about this, but it's going to go down as one of the big unexplained mysteries of these encounters. Something else that's been on my mind is the possibility that these young people on this space station may actually not have been aliens at all. What if there are others just like us out there, without spiritual or psychic superiority, just with more advanced technology? Could they be part of the breakaway civilization? That would explain why I got the feeling that they were not supposed to have toyed with me as they did. It would explain why nothing felt official, but rather thrown together out of spare parts, the way an illegal operation would have to do things. It would also explain why I didn't feel like I was dealing with higher intelligence. Maybe the two individuals I saw, who I thought were aliens, were actually humans with some sort of biological tech in their veins. What if my liaison didn't take me to the afterlife at all? Could it have been like a holodeck, where they simulated the experience in order to convince me that what I was seeing was genuine? It's interesting when I consider how many of these experiences feel like they could be some incredibly advanced form of virtual reality that is almost entirely indistinguishable from waking life. Could it all be caused by some technology that can remotely interface with consciousness and transport a soul from their physical body into a fabricated but very real environment? I do wonder about this. The idea that all of these experiences could be some kind of manufactured simulation used to convince me that I'm having alien contact, while the real reason for it all eludes me completely. I can't ever shake that as a plausible explanation. I've considered before that the experiences could have been designed by actual ETs as a safe environment for them to test and interact with certain individuals like myself, and give the experience of contact, perhaps as a primer for the real thing. That maybe what we tend to think of as the interdimensional aspect of the whole phenomena is merely technology indistinguishable from magic. That they are so staggeringly more advanced than us that our best guess about what's happening is that they reside in and/or travel through other dimensions of reality, with the ability to simulate an entire reality as convincing as our own. And if they can do that, how do we know that our reality is not also a manufactured experience created by them? And that's why I'll never really know what this is, even if they come down from the sky in their craft and walk out into my backyard and shake my hand. But for the sake of soldiering on, let's continue to assume that these contact experiences are what they appear to be. An induced out-of-body state, where I'm brought to an in-between dimension in order to interact with non-human intelligences. Regardless of the very confusing nature of this particular escapade, it has become clear to me, if I look at all the experiences collectively as one overall message, that they are really trying to underscore the connection between what we call death and interdimensional travel. That death is a place, and they can travel there and back with no trouble. It's trivial to them. For us, it's the most terrifying thing there is. Maybe that is the real power they hold over us. I've often thought about how, on some level, our entire lives are spent preparing for death, like it's some horrifying performance we have to do at the end of life, to brace ourselves to inevitably have everything we've ever known and everyone we've ever loved stripped away from us in an instant. And that's the performance. That's the magic trick you're getting up on stage to show everyone. It's a disappearing act. But we all know that when a magician disappears, they don't actually vanish into thin air. They just go beneath the stage or behind the curtains. And from there, they can hear the audience gasp in wonderment. The magician knows the whole time that there was never any danger or mystery, but the audience is left to wonder until someone comes along and shows them how the trick is performed. In the case of death, we may listen from behind the curtains to find that our loved ones are suffering greatly as a result of our sudden disappearance. And we can't just cross back over like these ETs and say, "Hey, I'm still right here. Everything's okay." Sometimes I think about what they've shown me, and if it is some kind of technology that they have that allows them to cross over into the realm of death and back, how much suffering could be relieved in our world with that kind of technology? To know that our loved ones still exist somewhere, even if their bodies could no longer perform the function of physically sharing the same dimension as us. These beings have taken me through that door to see my grandparents, and brought my grandparents through that door to see me. I understand the message. I just don't know why they want me to know this. What am I supposed to do about it? At first, it was an incredible realization, a burden-lifting revelation, to understand that death is not the end. To kind of know that as a fact was and is liberating. But it doesn't help the pain that I feel about what my passing will do to the ones I love. It doesn't help quell the fear of some horrifying thing happening to my son or anyone else I love. I feel no less empathy or sadness when I witness all the terrible things we do to each other. I still value life in all its beautiful forms, even if it's not as special of an experience as you might think when you still believe you only live once and this is it. For me, with this new understanding, it's not about life or death being permanent or not. It's about the pain and suffering of a sentient being, whether they are alive or dead, and wanting to save them or protect them. It's tough to think that death might not be the end of suffering, that it might not be the great relief we hope it will be. A wise person once said, "Life gives you the test first, and then the lesson." I've always found that to be true. Maybe the afterlife is no different. Maybe life is the test, and death is where the lesson begins. How can any of us be certain that we're truly prepared for a test if we don't know what we're being tested on? Hopefully it's not a test. Hopefully, We're not all being groomed for extra-dimensional assholes who wish to trap our souls as their pets and watch us feed on dinosaur bacon for their own amusement over the course of 524 years. Hopefully, when we die, we awaken and remember the vastness of our being. We do our life review, learn the lessons, thank the spirit guides, and then take a much-needed vacation where we get to turn into a formless, egoless blob of ethereal peace until we get bored of that and decide to take another incarnation somewhere in this universe or elsewhere. Wouldn't that be nice? Addendum. I recently spent some time in Moab, Utah, with my brother and his friends. As we traveled to our destination, we happened upon a strange and hilarious place off the main freeway called Jackass Joe's. The entire place was an homage to Roswell, alien lore, and of all things, jerky. A kooky roadside bodega boasting that they had the world's largest piece of jerky, and it was massive. It was stored behind thick tinted glass in a back room guarded by mannequins with laser guns, dressed like Area 51 guards from a 1980s B-movie. I wish I'd had the wherewithal to ask the shopkeep where the jerky actually came from. If it was a huge chunk of unfrozen woolly mammoth buttock, or if it had been simply glued together by thousands of smaller pieces of beef. But I wasn't thinking critically that day. I was overwhelmed by the array of different products they offered, and the disorienting glow of the neon green paint on all of the walls. The interior decor was like Comic-Con on mushrooms, and for reasons perhaps far more mysterious than the phenomena itself, this quirky off-road shop had combined their love of exotic dried meats and aliens, of all things. Their jerky section contained a wider variety of meat than I've ever seen anywhere, ranging from elk to alligator to turtle to rabbit, you name it. The entire place functioned as a gift shop and snack hub, featuring a plethora of products designed to essentially parody itself. It radiated the same odd and alluring quality that some of my contact experiences have had. It was almost as if the entire place had been created by ETs making fun of themselves. And humans, of course. The reason I'm tacking on this little tidbit to the end of this chapter, however, isn't just to inform you of my discovery of this bizarre place, but to share something that happened there which connected to the experience described in this chapter. Towards the back of the store was a section devoted solely to proprietary t-shirts, all of which featured alien-related AI slop-designed graphics, accompanied by the store's logo, of course. I thought about buying one, but I couldn't bring myself to support such a tasteless cash grab, even if it was self-aware. One t-shirt design caught my eye more than the others, and instantly brought me back to that moment when the liaison showed me the people waiting for the bacon to drop, and how I described it as looking so fake. It was a graphic of a flying saucer, piloted by caricatures of little green men flipping up their middle fingers while abducting an enormous piece of cartoon jerky. It wasn't just that the t-shirt graphic jarred my memory. I felt some psychic knowing that this was somehow related to what they showed me. But what was the connection? What was the message? Were they simply trying to illustrate that they could see forwards in time? To show me that they knew this would all happen, even if it didn't feel like a significant event or moment in time? For those of you who've been closely following my work, you'll know that I haven't released anything in many months. I've been trying to get this chapter out, but every time I went to work on it, something outside of my control would inevitably interrupt and seriously waylay the process. Now I'm wondering if it was all to delay the release until after I had visited this kitschy gift shop, so that I would make the connection between the t-shirt design and the experience and include it in the story. I don't know what this means, I just know it needed to be included. Maybe what the liaison showed me wasn't bacon. Maybe it was jerky.